Welcome to the Tuesday night lecture series sponsored by the Natalie and James Thompson Art Gallery. Tonight we have a lecture by interdisciplinary artist Anna Lehner, and here to introduce them is Chelsea Tomto from our own art department.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. So before I get into the more official introduction, Anna and I met during grad school. I had the very great luck of having a studio close by, and I got to witness their rigor and their creativity firsthand. One of the things I was really struck by with Anna when we first met was their interdisciplinary approach, and not just within art, but also across disciplines within academia. And that approach also inspired my own art making. So it's really such a great pleasure to have Anna here. So Anna Lehner is an interdisciplinary artist working at the intersections of art and structural geology. In 2019, Lehner received an MFA and MA in glass at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was a graduate associate in the Center for Culture, History, and Environment within the Nelson Institute. In 2016, they received a BFA in 3D Fine Art and a BA in Art History from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Lehner has received multiple awards, including a Fulbright Graduate Research Award in New Zealand, the International Jodakuni Friends Memorial Award, and included in professional publications such as New Glass Review and the Corning Museum of Glass. So welcome, Anna. We're really excited that you're here.
All right. Thank you, Chelsea. Really appreciate that very warm welcome. I want to say thank you to Chelsea, thank you to Elena, thank you to all the wonderful grad students I got to spend time with today. I really appreciate it. The work that you're all doing gives fuel for our community, so keep up the work. I was really inspired by the conversations we were able to have today. So like Chelsea said, we met at UW-Madison not too long ago in grad school. I'm just going to kind of give you a really brief background into who I am. My pronouns are they, them. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and my background is primarily in glass. This is me blowing glass with one of my good friends, Emily Leach, at UW-Madison. Chelsea is also a very accomplished glassblower as well. We work together a lot in the studio there, but a lot of my gravitation towards the current body of work that I've been doing over the last few years stems from glass and stems from working with a molten three-dimensional material. I found quite a lot of crossover interest between temperature and fracture and the qualities that glass embodies as kind of perfect metaphors for the themes that I'm working with in my practice. So I have a foundational root in glass. I've been working with glass for the last 10 years, but I'm a sculpture artist. I'm an installation artist. Really what drives me are the themes in my practice and the materials that best suit those themes. So kind of getting to the three main themes that orbit in and around my practice: time, temperature, and fracture. Like Chelsea said, I have a deep interest in geologic connections, geologic timescale, and that history, that material record in reference to our own. So the underlying stressors within the Earth's tectonic plates constantly shape the land which we inhabit. The fault lines and tremors in our continental surfaces tell a story of foundation that is constant motion and in constant unrest. I'm interested in exploring these facets of fracture and their connection to our past. So temperature, glass comes into play in my practice a lot. Breakage, repair, stress buildup are all things that I'm interested in exploring through my work. So time scale, which you see in its full form here, was a piece that referenced the Earth through its material, but incorporated the active action of earthquakes in real time. So the glass in the ceiling above was a semi-porous cast black glass that would, behind it, release a drop of ink every time there was an earthquake detected globally. The ink would drop into a pile of sand on the floor below, and this crater would start to form, each drop of ink marking the event of an earthquake. When this exhibition was installed, there was also a running update, live feed of earthquakes coming through. So I'm interested in this moment of earthly bodily movement to our own. And so this drop, capturing a moment in time, felt earthquakes, not felt earthquakes, some of the smallest quakes that we can't even feel that are constantly moving and in motion. I created this series of prints based off of that same mechanism. So that mechanism is tied into the USGS earthquake notification service. So I worked with engineers. I worked with them to develop a code that would then trigger this mechanism. So, you know, Chelsea alluded to being inspired by me. I am so inspired by Chelsea because we work in these ways of kind of exploring new media in a way that it's not just a mechanism, that it's part of the material process. And so that's what really drove me, is earthquakes are not just something the work is about, it's a material that is part of the artwork itself. And I think that is really key because often we make work that is imbued with story and extends, you know, we make work about things, but the work is also, those materials are a part of it as well. So in addition to this work, I kept a journal. I had the earthquake notifications sent to my phone for a month. And every time I received a notification, I would write down the time, what I was doing in very brief form, and the magnitude, intensity of the earthquake, and where it was located. I really was interested in this process of digital to hand to ink to kind of recording that moment in time in relation to the personal. I'm really interested in material studies. While I was at Madison, I was able to connect with the geoscience program, and luckily I had a professor who was really interested in my work and having conversations crossing between geology, glass, and the concepts I was interested in. And so through that time spent in the geoscience program, I got to work with one of the other professors there who specializes in microscopic studies of rock. And there is this glassy rock that's created through friction that marks a fault line movement, becomes molten for that second in friction, and then fills those cracks. So it has this memory, this molten connection to glass, but it is of that rock material. And so I spent some time looking at it through thin sections under a microscope, looking at the breakage and repair that naturally happens within the rock. Spent some time etching that imagery into glass, but I was really interested in the duality between naturally occurring and human-made, and I was thinking a lot about hard and soft, obviously with temperature changes, and I wanted to kind of create this fabric that is of the microscopic imagery, but also has this very warm, tactile, human-made quality to it. And thinking about the micro to macro translation of break and repair and weaving. The last large installation that I did was part of my master's thesis, Master's of Fine Arts thesis, and it was this long installation. So similar to the drop of ink, I wanted another piece that was reactive to earthquakes in real time. And so using this traditional technique, this old technique of creating window glass, which is no longer created this way, but by making these discs, these rondelles, I wanted this piece to react to earthquakes in real time, kind of reminiscent almost of an epicenter map as it shows up. And so all these pieces are free floating. So they're on these triangular bases, they free float, they're in relation to one another. So, and then throughout the exhibition, there are little mechanisms that react to earthquakes in real time at different magnitudes. So I have a video next that'll just show the very lightest magnitude earthquake mechanism agitating and moving the glass. So throughout the course of this exhibition, this piece rattle, shook, and then also a very kind of similar byproduct of this installation was these beautiful ripple effects the glass kind of captures and projects onto the floor, which I also thought was a really great correlation between seismic activity and how it perpetuates. So in 2020, I got the wonderful opportunity to go to New Zealand. I was awarded a Fulbright research fellowship, and I wrote my fellowship to spend time out in the field in this very seismically active place, which New Zealand is located in and around some pretty major fault lines and tectonic activity, and then have that directly translate into my work with collaboration from artists and scientists in New Zealand. And so, as you all can imagine, 2020, I got about a month into the field, and then the world turned, and so I still got to spend time in New Zealand. I pursued a project the best I could. I did decide to stay the full year, luckily enough, but most of our travel plans were halted. But this is a photo from one of the lakes that I got to go out into the field with some scientists. We were taking lake core samples of lakes that dot the Alpine Fault, which is one of the major faults in New Zealand. And these lakes retain sedimentary history of motion and movement of sediment from and due to earthquakes. So we were looking at really kind of very minute changes on a natural archive scale, but were some pretty amazing adventures. So I was really lucky to be part of this team. They put me to work, and that was the whole deal, is if I could lift things up and down and help them out, I could join, and I felt really fortunate to have had that experience. So see, these are some of the lake cores. A lot of the slides I'm going to show you until the end of my presentation are the things that I'm looking at, the research that I'm talking about with these scientists. It's a really delicate balance to collaborate, and I think it's one that often tends to be difficult but very rewarding. And so these were some of the cores that we were looking at together, and these are CT scans next to an image of the core. And they were showing me these different lines of deposits that actually mark an earthquake, and they can look at and generate seismic output through looking at just these core samples. And so let's see if I can use the pointer on the slide. Let's see if this works. Can you see that? Yeah. So right in here, this marks the 2016 magnitude 7.8 earthquake right here. And I was really taken with these layers, these very delicate layers of really vital information, and also the core form itself, kind of referencing almost column-like forms, relating our natural sedimentary kind of foundations that are always in flux, and kind of comparing that to our architectural foundations that we create. And so I was really interested in the different density layers of the sediment. I worked to recreate these into 3D models that eventually became 3D prints, which eventually got translated into molds that were then cast with glass. And so these are just some in-progress shots of working through that. And what started out as sediment turned into something that looks very much like an ice core. But I was interested in bubble density, captured air, and kind of translating these relationships between naturally occurring archive to sculptural form. And through this, some larger pieces are going to grow out of this. These are to scale, so they're pretty small, about 16 inches tall. Eventually, I'm working towards some larger pieces that will be reminiscent of structural forms, I-beams, columns that'll then be redone in glass and other fragile materials to reference our natural foundations in reference to the ones that we create. There's some testing going on between volcanic glass, some of these rocking objects that will also be kinetic, so some in-progress stuff, just playing around with those things. And that's my information. Thank you all for being here today. I'm happy to stick around for questions and answers.
I'll start. I'm curious because you went a little fast over kind of a question that I often have with work like this, which is like how you connect the work that you're doing in the studio with these incredibly complex scientific processes. I mean, how much of your work is just sitting around and doing, copious amounts of research to even arrive at kind of the initial idea of like these captured bubbles in the ice and all of that? I think that's something that often in the classroom, students look at something like this and they think it's like, wow, that's great, that's wonderful, that must have been done so quickly and efficiently. And then that scientific, the acquisition of knowledge and the back labor that happens behind a work of art like this, I think is also part of that, intense emotional and research-based process that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there is a lot of kind of mining for information that then spurs, it's a give and take. So a lot of my physical practice in the studio is a lot of material testing. So as a glass artist, as a maker, I'm constantly kind of going through those things that, are very kind of mineral in its origin. That's kind of going on. And then also in the same vein, I'm pursuing lines of inquiry like reaching out to scientists. For like the Fulbright especially, that was kind of the culmination of, it was born out of a connection in grad school to my geology professor. And through those conversations, we had conversations in my studio, we had conversations in class when I was taking geology classes. So I am by no means an expert on geoscience, but having partnered in a way that we could collaborate, we could talk about the themes to make sure that I was paying proper respect to the information that I've been given, and then to also understand that this is, that's also the tricky bit too, because science and art is a buzzword, and it can be really a fascinating endeavor, but it also becomes difficult when the lines of inquiry and research also need to be it's a part of a poetry, it's part of a response. So I do say that my work is really rooted in geologic themes, but that my research is artistic research. And so it is really founded by the story and input of that collaboration and that conversation and that understanding, but that it's being taken in an artistic direction through poetry and through translation. So it's not, scientific research, but it is really informed by the conversations I've had, the time I've been able to spend out in the field, and I feel really fortunate that the Fulbright was an opportunity that could allow that kind of conversation. The university setting was amazing because I was able to get into a class that wasn't in the art program that opened my horizon. And then I just, through that, I've been able to be connected with a few other scientists who are open to working with artists. It is a constant juggle of give and take and shared resources and how you work through that. I think collaboration is a tricky thing, but it can also be very exciting and rewarding. So I hope that kind of answered your question. Okay, yeah, you're welcome. Oh, sorry.
Just following up on that, as you were speaking of that delicate balance I wondered, you have been inspired and informed by your poetic response to these experiences. I'm wondering, do you have a perception of how you may have affected the scientists? It sounds like you have great dialogue, which is fantastic. But I wondered if there's any way you could measure it, or perhaps you can't, but it made me think about, anyway.
Yeah, I think.
Circle of collaboration and influence.
Yeah, I think there's. It's a good question. I haven't like recorded responses from scientists necessarily, but what is interesting is I find that when I start the conversation, the initial response is, like communication, scientific communication and design is really important, but I feel like that's the first foray. It's like, you're artistic, so you do posters and you design, which is wonderful, but it's kind of a different slice of the pie. So I feel like I have to get through that hurdle oftentimes when talking about this work. But I think that like through discussions on like, when I talk about installation and like really this work is not quite where I see it in the future, but they think about how their research has like longer visual legs than, because they're writing, putting out papers, moving on to the next bit of research. And so what I found is in working through this artwork, it was like a chance to pause and consider how this can reach a different audience and how it can go beyond the research that they have to do in a way that I think the visual medium has, and just like any other artistic medium, it fills this other way of communicating. So I think that for a lot of people, it took some time to, and that was the other thing that it was not something I was expecting, but it was like make the work and then like kind of sit and percolate and then have conversations with scientists. I think some people were excited. Other people were like, this is not science. Look at it. And that's fine. But I found that there was a lot of time to like pause and reflect and like consider a core in a different way, that it can exist in a different way that just isn't data to be written down in a paper, but that it has physical presence. So yeah, sorry, not to go on too long about that, but.
Hey Anna, thank you so much. You answered part of what I was going to ask, but dovetailing on that, like what tips do you have in approaching those types of opportunities and relationships to work with scientists, either individually or like I've even seen and looked at types of residencies that maybe offer that. So they already are saying, well, we like you say, it's a buzz, the art plus science, right?
Yeah.
What would you recommend like going into those kinds of opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the exciting thing is that there are more residencies, grant opportunities that are already kind of set up to facilitate that, and that can make it an easier way to start those dialogues. When I think back to when I started reaching out and asking questions about this, I went to a lot of talks that were really science heavy. So like I would look up, there was an ice core talk that I was really interested in. It was really dense. It was super, super dense. It was at Madison, but I went up to the lecturer afterwards and I asked some questions about art and science. And so that kind of started the dialogue. So because I went to that talk and could kind of gain some understanding, it then gave me like kind of the next step. They knew that I went to that talk, obviously a scientist, but I'm interested in these themes. And I actually found that being like, I came to this talk, I'm really interested in this. Can you explain this more to me? I'm an artist, showed them my work. And sometimes it was great, and other times it didn't pass muster, but I feel like showing up to the community that you're interested in connecting to, it was a good first step. But also to like, I left it open-ended so that if anybody didn't really want to talk about it, that it wasn't something I was overbearing about. But I think that kind of helped. And there's, like thinking about the Fulbright, and I think too, like, what's really beautiful about being in a university setting is that you have those connections across disciplines. And it really depends on the professor, but some people are really, a lot of people that I worked with at Madison were really open to like, oh, you're not a science major, you're not an environmental science major, but you're interested in this, that's awesome. So that kind of helped. I hope that kind of answers your question, but, and then like in terms of not the academic setting, like I connected with a few groups in Minneapolis. I'm working on connecting to a few environmental justice groups. So I think too, like going beyond the bounds of just your art making practice and looking at what the community is doing and being a part of that as a active participant outside of your art practice also makes a significant difference in making those next step connections in the work that you want to do. So, yeah.
I have a question about material. Being that you come from this geologic background, and also I have some working knowledge of glass, and that translation of material, I was wondering if you could like speak to maybe the rocks and sediments that are harvested and how that relates back to the materials you've chosen to use.
Yeah, so the rocks and sediment, I think, I haven't recreated any, I'm not on the so full on the glass chemistry side yet. That still might happen, but glass is this kind of, it's an amorphous solid. So it has that temperature boundary that, a few of the other, I'm just gonna quickly go back to the pseudotactylite. I think, sorry if this is making anybody motion sick. But this glassy rock, I think that, I keep coming back to mineral and material, and glass itself is often thought as fragile, but the components of glass are so prevalent in our foundations. And obviously it's the right mixing of material, but when I look at fracture and repair and a glassy rock that's created as the moment in which that memory is trapped, I think that memory holding is what glass does really, really well. And so it has ties into this material. It is different, but I think that we're so used to our manufactured forms of the material we get and we use as artists, and I'm, case in point, is that often I like being able to look into natural glasses as like, this is naturally occurring, and how does this form, and how does this function, and it's marking a moment in time. And so that, to me, that mark making in time is really something that draws me to the material. Have I gotten there yet with my work? I don't think I'm there yet, but it's definitely a question I'm asking of what the next pieces encompass. So did that kind of answer your question, or is there another? Yeah, okay, cool. Yes?
Technical question. How do you make a mold and pour glass into it and make it, what do you make the mold out of?
Yeah.
And you just get it liquid and pour, or you use a ladle?
There's a lot of different ways. So yes, I will talk about, why don't I jump to
The last picture.
the last one. Sorry. This is, I'll just touch on this quick. This is blown glass. So the first image, gather glass onto a pipe. You're working with it at 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's one way of forming the glass. And then casting it, so you have your form, you create a mold around that form, and this type of casting is technically called lost wax casting. These are actually 3D printed in PLA, and you can melt out PLA, but the mold material is what allows it to stay at temperature, not fall apart. So it's plaster, silica, and then some other refractory mix to give it strength. And so it's made around that form. that form has a reservoir. It gets melted out, whether it's wax or PLA, or dug out if it's clay, and then you fill that cavity with glass. And oftentimes, the lost wax process, you make your mold, you put cold glass in the top of it, it melts through and fills that form. So the kiln does all of the heating. It slowly comes up to temperature. At melting temperature, it'll fill the mold, and then because it's glass, you really have to slowly, we have all sorts of programs that's figured out for the glass we use, slowly brought down to temperature so all the stress is relieved. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other casting types with similar mold processes, but there is a ladling process that's hot casting where you cast into sand and you literally scoop the molten glass out of the furnace, dump it in the mold, and then you slowly put it in the kiln, bring it down to room temperature. So, but this was all lost wax casting style. Lost PLA.
So, technical question. When you're melting out PLA, is that done in a kiln or is it steamed down?
It's done in a kiln. It's at a very specific temperature, so you don't start melting too high a temperature to have toxic fumes. I can't exactly remember what the temperature is.
112 to 215.
Yeah. But wax we steam out. That's like the safest way to do it. Some people do burnout lost wax castings in a burnout kiln. When we were at Madison, foundry and glass were right next to each other. So a lot of the whole mold making room was shared. And so a few of those processes cross over really nicely. Because we were talking earlier today about bronze casting and glass have a lot of similarities. So that's kind of neat. Just difference in how they come down to room temperature. So glass is really fragile, and we have to spend more time annealing it and bringing it down to room temperature for it to be okay and not spontaneously want to blow itself apart. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I just have a couple of observations. On your thesis showed the brittle boundaries. Were you just wowed when the cement crack was in the room, or did you place that crack?
Oh, that was, I know that gallery really well. So it's in the same building as my studio, and time scale was in there as well. Spent a lot of time in that space, and so when I was planning out the work, it was just perfect for it. Yep.
No, I saw it. It just
Yep.
With your, and you don't necessarily have to answer this, in your project accumulated time, the earthquake equals one drop,
Yep.
1 day, 1 month.
Yep.
No, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month.
Yes.
I think, is that correct?
Yep.
And I wondered, I asked myself, did you, the artist, really do 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month?
Yep.
Or did you do many more and then cull it and edit it back to that? I wondered, where were you curating?
Yeah.
In that process, fascinating process.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was a few trial and error setups with the paper and the mechanism, but I did a series of other ones. I kind of came down to those 3 because I was thinking about, in a way, the exponential scale of earthquakes. Obviously the systems we give them so we understand their intensity, but those kind of breakdowns to me, in reference to the journal I kept as well, were just kind of signifiers that I felt like kind of had that come across in a way. And obviously the pairing of 3 is kind of a really nice translation to see that timeline. But it was a bit of a smaller project. So I think if I were to do it again, go up in scale and explore more time, but those were kind of the 3 touchstones that I felt kind of worked the best in terms of translating that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question. So can you go to the material study, the most recent kinetic thing that you showed near the end?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so in seeing this, I was really curious and struck by something that, a through line in your work that I had not really thought about before, which is just this idea of something being kinetic, or the movement, right? From the time scale and the drips, which are facilitated through new media processes, and then thinking about the same thing with the brittle boundaries, and now this. the two-part question is, one, how do you see these things moving? And then two, what do you have any thoughts about that impulse towards making something that has movement in it in your practice?
Yeah, so these, that's a great question. These, what I foresee is to have them rock. So to have the glass piece be like, these will kind of be on platforms that'll instigate the rocking in motion of the glass. So the glass has a bit more of an active play because like the two pieces before, they're very controlled mechanisms that impact the glass. But the thought behind this is to actually, so volcanic rock, human-made glass, and then there's going to be layers in which this solid piece of glass sits. So the whole kind of play with this, and it's definitely in the play stage, is to have a bunch of different layers that scrape and roll past one another as this interior weight kind of propels that with the information of, it might be earthquakes, it might be another sort of mechanism kind of pushing these pieces. And so I'm really interested when this goes into some more testing is to see how those materials rub against one another, what kind of information works its way into those layers. So making kinetic work is really exciting to me because I think it offers an additional active voice in the work that, to me, I want to relinquish some control. And having earthquakes as part of the work has always been a kind of moving system that's not predictable. Obviously, I have control in the mechanisms that I create, but I think this might be moving towards something that incorporates that a little bit more or in a new and different direction. But yeah, do you have any other questions around that? Okay.
I was just curious about how, seeing things in this state, like seeing the rondelles before they're activated by some kinetic thing. It's like there's a lot of ways it could be activated. I guess my follow-up question on this image as well is kind of back to Michael's question about material. I know that in grad school you also did some testing on physically incorporating the natural glass with the manufactured glass, and I was curious if this feels like a very different relationship, and I'm just curious if what other formal explorations you've done between those two.
Yeah,
material.
I think that's still something to be explored. This is kind of on the edge of optical devices because these solid forms may at some point come together, and then that would be a different conversation of how the volcanic glass is suspended in between this human-made glass, but it is different. Still definitely in the play stage, but in terms of more combination between the two, I think that's still to be explored a little bit more through some material investigation. So. Yeah.
So how did you make them? Did you drop it or is it a ball?
So, so these are cast. They're hot cast into a graphite mold. So they're marble molds actually for, they're really big marble molds. So they're about 5 inches around. They're ladled out of a furnace, cast into these graphite molds, put in the kiln, slowly brought down to temperature, and then they're kind of cold worked. So they're polished to kind of give it that semi-sheen, which is another process in glass. But the rock is not fixed. So the kinetic piece is motion of the glass versus motion of the rock as well. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation, though.
Awesome.
As we head outside to the student openings. Thank you so much, Anna,
Yeah,
for being
thank
here
you.
this evening.